Hello, everyone, and welcome to the latest edition of FCM Collective, Main Street Recovery, Reviving Communities Through Data. FCM is pleased to be collaborating with our partner Moneris to present this discussion today. My name is David Cooper, Principal and Founder of Leading Mobility Consulting, and I'll be your host and moderator for the next hour. I'd like to start us with land acknowledgement today. So as we move forward with our commitment to reconciliation, FCM acknowledges that our offices are located on the unceded, unsurrendered territory of the Anishinaabe Nation, whose presence here reaches back to time immemorial. As an organization, we endeavor to unlearn colonial mindsets and practices, grow in our knowledge, and adapt ways of working. As we continue to build meaningful relationships, we recognize the historic and ongoing contributions of Indigenous peoples and honor their leadership and partnership in shaping and strengthening communities across our country. Before we begin today, I do have a few housekeeping items to mention. The session is available with simultaneous interpretation. To participate in the session in French, you simply click on the globe icon at the bottom tab of your Zoom screen and select the French option. If you do not select the language, you will hear the live audio in English. I'll be joined in this session today by 4 esteemed panelists who will introduce in just a moment. I'll be posing questions to them throughout the discussion, as well as lending my perspective to the conversation. Please pose your questions to this panel in the chat, and we'll attempt to get as many questions as we can in the latter part of the program. Finally, please note that the session is being recorded and will be available on demand on the FCM website. So I'm very pleased with you today and the FCM for today's very timely conversation. As municipal leaders, you know that downtown urban cores and rural main streets are vital economic engines in all of our communities, which brings us to today's discussion. We're here to hear from industry and municipal leaders on what has been working in drawing people back to main streets and the ideas for revitalizing downtowns after pandemic disruptions. Maybe a little bit of insights for myself on this. So I've been working in transportation planning and policy for 18 years, 15 of them in the public sector with the City of Calgary, City of Toronto, and TransLink. And as a transportation planner who works to help shape our cities and who works to put in infrastructure, mostly on the transit side, we need to have data to have informed decision-making. We need to understand the impact of our work in our communities. And what was really cool in today's conversation is a couple of factors. So one of the most significant projects I got to be part of in my career was the King Street pilot. We had King Street runs through the downtown, right through the heart of downtown Toronto, goes right through the economic core of our country. And we had a problem. And the problem was that we had streetcar services that were relied on by 65,000 people a day that were running about 3 to 4 kilometers an hour. You could walk faster than taking the streetcar. And there was a big push from city staff such as myself, the TTC, BAs, and our partners to really start solving the problem of getting people to work in a reliable, convenient way. And one of the really interesting parts of that particular project of repurposing our streets and the function of King Street, which wasn't working for anyone, like you couldn't drive down there fast, you couldn't access transit, utilize it fast, was the creation of the King Street pilot, where we looked at ways to repurpose lanes, we looked at ways to improve transit operations. And one of the biggest conversation drivers of that was economic activity and business activity. And in the formulation of our reporting program for the King Street pilot, which is now permanent, which was quite successful. We had 15,000 new transit riders that joined the King Street corridor after the introduction. And the new problems was actually getting enough streetcars to additional fleets to actually move people with the business economic data. And there was a really cool work that was done with Moneris in terms of looking at business transaction data. And over the course of the 1-year pilot period for the evaluation, we did see a reduction of transaction activity of about 0.8%, which is negligible, particularly from the restaurant sector. But that was also a sector that was seeing a decline in transaction data just because we had a lot of redevelopment in the area, and there was just also other types of trends. But to even have the data to answer that question was super powerful in our ability to really justify that particular program. The other piece that of my interest in this particular space is I recently did some work with Transport Canada on looking at mobility innovation, how cities leverage data and innovative technologies to transform transportation in their particular communities. And there's a whole wealth of abilities to really tackle this from a municipal side, but also work with our third parties and our business community and looking at different components of how we can shape our cities through data and technology. So enough about me. I'm going to dive right into our 4 esteemed panelists. who really come from a wealth of different sectors, which is going to be quite exciting to have a conversation with them today. So our first panelist is Sean McCormick. He's the head of growth strategy at Spendscape. Sean is an expert in consumer spending data. He joined Moneris in 2015 as their head of growth strategy for Spendscape, a Moneris company, which enables the private and public sector organizations to use payment data to improve their forecasting capabilities, new customers, and inform policy decisions. Thank you for joining us today. Second, we have Tom Gerben. He's the Director of Downtown Vibrancy and Safe City for the City of Edmonton, where he provides leadership, expertise, and coordination in the delivery of activities that contribute to the safe and vibrant city with a focus on downtown Edmonton. And I'm quite excited to be joined by another Edmontonian. I'm born and raised from there and started my career there. So quite excited to hear about Tom's insights from his work in Edmonton. We have Kay Matthews. Kay is the Executive Director of the Ontario Business Improvement Association, which represents 300 plus BIAs throughout the province of Ontario. She has 20 years in BIA management, 10 years working within an urban BIA, and 5 years within a rural BIA. So Kay is going to be able to talk about how there are synergies and also differences in how we could leverage data and insights in the work at the Main Street level. Kay has worked in the heritage and arts sectors in Mississauga for 10 years and has overall been in this space working in communities for about 30 years now. And then we also have Nelson Rogers, who's the principal consultant of community ingenuity. Dr. Rogers is a researcher and consultant in areas related to community development and applied research and innovation with particular expertise in the rural context. He's the co-author of the Big Data for Small Places program, a capacity building approach to rural data utilization, and is currently an advisor to the Rural Ontario Institute of Rural Data Dashboard Project. So I'd like to thank everyone for coming here. We have a great mix of public sector, private sector, community partners, academic, and just from really the rural and urban context of really across different communities in our country. So I'm going to start off with a little bit of a warm-up question for everyone. And I'll go around to all four panelists, but I'll start off with Kay. How do you see the nexus of leveraging data and program development in your work supporting Main Streets and an overall really downtown recovery?
Thank you, David, and thank you to the Federation of Canadian Municipalities for inviting me today. This has been a really interesting one, and I think COVID has really brought it to light, is that there may be a lot of data on full communities, but when it actually comes to the geography of Main Street, there really hasn't been a great deal of data that focuses on that particular work. So it really has moved us into fulfilling a dream that I'm going to be talking about in a little bit. But we really had to leverage a lot of different data. And to be honest, in many cases, there's a ton of data. It's just knowing how to use it, which is often one of the biggest aspects and challenges that we have. And as a not-for-profit organization, it's also very expensive for us to be able to access a lot of it. So we've really had to think very, very differently throughout COVID and throughout the crisis that we continue to be under on how we can leverage that information. One of the things we did was with the Ministry of Agriculture, Food and Rural Affairs is we got a grant to do a study on the movement, people no longer working in their homes or in their offices, and now they're working in their communities. So we were able to do that, and how, if you're planning on moving your business outside of Toronto, where would be the place that people would want to go. So it's a really great study that we did back in 2020, 2021. I have put our website in the chat. So if you go into projects, you'll be able to see that as well. But I think one of the most important things that we did in the absence of data that was really focused on Main Streets was immediately when the crises began, we started to gather our BIAs around a twice weekly table. So we opened up Zoom, we brought in, rather than having webinars, which are great, we really felt the most important thing was for them to talk about what their challenges are. how they're addressing them, what solutions they were putting in. And OBIA has a very strong mandate, and it's all based on something we fondly call R&D, rip off and duplicate. There's no point in, if you've got 300 BIAs across the province, believe me, they're all willing to share their findings, their projects, right down to their policies that they created in dealing with them. But I think one of the best things that happened at the beginning of it, and I really hope it continues for now on, was that for the first time, our BIAs were often brought to the emergency tables. And because really our main streets became ground zero for everything that happened outside of the hospitals. When it came to, the businesses were closed, especially in Ontario, and I can't speak for the rest of Canada, but, their big boxes were allowed to open, but small businesses weren't. We had obviously the effect of our retail, but we also had all of our professionals, that are lawyers and our accountants, who weren't able to reach their customers and clients as well. So, that weekly conversation, which continues today, has really been one wonderful way that we've been able to leverage information rather than data. We're still working on getting the actual data, and again, I'll talk about that in a bit. But we also had already started a project called Digital Main Street with the province of Ontario. And then we were able to bring in the FedDev on Ontario, working with the Toronto Association of BIAs. We've really been able to send out grants to small businesses to help them leverage digital technologies. That is a great deal of non-proprietary data that we're really being able to look at, to see trends, to see how things are changing, and to see how our businesses are adapting to all of the changes that have been brought to them. They're far not out of the woods yet, and sorry for my grammar there, but they're not out of the woods, not even close. But so there's a lot of different aspects that we're working on, and it's really trying to gather that data that's really focused on the main street or the neighborhood community or wherever that BIA is. That is still something we're really working on and trying to leverage.
Thank you, Kay. And it's really interesting to hear how your community is supporting each other through joint collaboration. Transit was the same way, like everyone shares everything, we're all in it together. So, and also very interesting insights when it came to kind of just the resourcing and really just kind of the sharing of those components. I'm gonna go around the table and we'll just have to maybe about just a couple of key points. Go to Tom next. So the question again is, how do you see the nexus of leveraging data and program development in your work supporting main streets and downtown recovery, particularly in your work in downtown Edmonton?
Yeah, great. Thanks, David. Appreciate the opportunity to be here and acknowledge that the traditional land that I'm gathered on here in Edmonton is on Treaty 6 territory. Data is a really big part of what we do. And the tenet of our downtown work is our downtown vibrancy strategy. 20 actions. One of the actions is actually ensuring that we have adequate data. And we work continuously to try to source it because, quite frankly, it's difficult to find it at the community level, especially specific geographic region to downtown, which is the focus of my work. One of the key pieces as we continue our recovery from COVID is determining where the opportunities are. So activation is a word that we use a lot in economic development. It means a lot of different things, but we've spent millions of dollars in activation. Our downtown vibrancy strategy, we have a funding program that's granted over $6.5 million in 2022. And a lot of that money went to activation and understanding where the best return on investment is of the public dollars, but also how it can best support our recovery and support the businesses that are within our downtown is a real big key. So that's one of our focuses as we move into 2023 is making sure we're leveraging that data and understanding both where the opportunities are to support the businesses and support further activation, but what the result is of it. So it can come from a variety of sources, but definitely I stress that here in Edmonton, it's difficult to find it at the community level. And by community, I mean really like the neighborhood level. So We're always open to working with industry partners and, you know, our stakeholders here in Edmonton, especially in terms of sourcing that data and making sure that we're leveraging it to the best of our ability as we continue to recover and support downtown revitalization.
Thanks, Tom. I'll turn over to Sean next. So maybe from your perspective in the private sector side, you know, where do you see your role in the nexus of leveraging data and program development and supporting downtown reactivation?
Yeah, further to what, you know, Tom and Kay both talked about in terms of, you know, measuring economic activity, either before, during, or after an event, and trying to validate the economic impact of an event or an infrastructure change. Moneris processes payments for about 30 to 40% of all transactions in Canada. It's a massive amount of data. And because it's so large, we're able to segment it into different spending categories like restaurants or apparel or shoes or grocery. And when a municipality or a province or even the federal government, when they want to look at and measure Canadian spending patterns over time, we're an incredible source of that data because we process for all card brands, all credit and debit. You know, so that ability to really take the pulse of the economic community within a geofence, and a geofence, not to get too technical, but it's very simple. You're just drawing a line around a study area, and then you're looking at payments that are happening within that area and putting them into different buckets, and then measuring weekly trends over time. You know, so we support a lot of municipalities with data like that. And then another thing that we've gotten into the last couple of years, which municipalities and governments and you know, different, you know, arm's length organizations like BIAs are leveraging, is things like consumer location data. So not only do we know where people are traveling from to come and shop in a certain district, we also know the category that they're spending in, and we know how much they're spending, because we don't model our spending. Our transactions are not modeled; they're real, and we love supporting municipalities with this kind of data. It actually helped. An urban institute in Ontario distribute grant money or support money coming out of the pandemic to different main streets across southern Ontario that were the hardest hit by the pandemic. So they used our data to look at how each of these municipalities were performing, or each of these main streets were performing before the pandemic, and then during, in the middle of the pandemic, because they had to decide. They had hundreds of applications, but only so much to go around. So they wanted to look at the top 30 most negatively impacted, and we were able to report on that and support their decision-making in the distribution of those funds.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because there's a lot of different government formulaic ways of funding allocations. That's for obviously the pandemic, but also this. But yeah, that's quite interesting. Thank you for that, Sean. Nelson, you get to advise communities with really data and their program development. How do you shape really your relationship between using data in your policy recommendations and the work that you do in more of a rural communities?
Well, the rural and small town communities that I'm working with are facing similar issues to some of the things that Kay mentioned in small area data, where BIAs are often small areas surrounded by an urban area. The communities I'm working with are rural townships and small towns distant from an urban area, but the small area data issues are the same. And so there's a number of interesting things going on. I'm involved in a national project with Standards Council of Canada and CSA Group to develop a national standard for the assessment of rural community well-being. And that includes economic, social, and environmental well-being. I know the webinar today is largely about economic well-being, but it really needs to be seen in the context of social and environmental well-being. Also, a little later on, I'm going to talk specifically about a project I'm working with and advising the Rural Ontario Institute about a new rural data dashboard project, But I'm aware that across Canada, there are a lot of similar rural data projects underway that are really going beyond just providing data to making data useful. And the tagline I like to use is turning data into information and information into action. And that's the space that I work in. So you've got Memorial University, Newfoundland and Labrador with the community accounts system, and a version of the community accounts has been adapted by Northern Policy Institute for Northern Ontario. You've got the Alberta Rural Development Network working in rural data in that context. There's some interesting things coming out of Victoria Island University in Nanaimo about small area data in that context. So I know there are a lot of projects, I've probably forgotten a half a dozen, but there are a lot of projects coming out of Rural Development Institute in Brandon, Manitoba, around making rural data useful. So although I'm going to talk today largely about a current project in Ontario, I realize there's parallel things happening addressing the same kinds of issues about availability of data. And then once and many of the clients I'm working with are saying there's too much data, I just can't wade through it all. How do I find the slice of data that's going to answer the particular question or particular opportunity that's right in front of me? So I'm quite excited to be part. I was asked to join as an advisor to Rural Ontario Institute on this particular dashboard project, and I think it's an example of the kind of thing that can really help data become more useful.
Yeah, and those collaborations are quite interesting, and definitely the resource support, and sometimes it can be overwhelming with the amount of data that you can go through, and how you can work together would be quite interesting. I'm going to move over to specific discussion questions we have today for everyone on different thematic areas when it comes to bringing back people to our downtowns and our main streets. And I'm going to go to Kay, and we'll spend about 3 minutes per question. And then we'll have time for a Q&A with our audience here. So this question's for Kay. The role of our streets has been changing from even before the pandemic. We now have temporary uses with patios, new micromobility programs. This is like e-bikes and e-scooters. We have open street programs in many cities. We have curbside management looking at deliveries and goods movement, and many more things that are happening in our street right-of-ways. What economic data are you using to assess business impact and opportunities from these changes in our streets and within our downtowns and really on our main streets as a whole? Sorry, Kay, you're on mute.
Thank you again, David. I really do, just building on what Nelson said first, and then I'll move over to your question, is the data we actually really need right now is how the current social issues that are hampering main streets and how they're severely impacting our main streets, and how is that actually negatively affecting the economy. And I think, I'm hearing more and more, again, when I talk about our main streets being ground zero, seriously, they have been ground zero for everything. So, what is the economic impact of people not wanting to come to an area because they don't feel safe anymore? This is a really important aspect that we need. Maybe Moneris's data could help us do that, but it's beyond that as well. So that is a plea. But I'm going to back up a little bit to answer your question. So back in 2017, OBIA with the Ministry of Municipal Affairs conducted a return on investment of BIA's project. In 2017, therefore, we created what we thought were some indicators of success of a main street. What are the key components that pull it together? We weren't really able to move further. Again, being a not-for-profit means that you can access, even accessing data is a very expensive proposition. So that has become quite problematic. But what we did decide to do eventually was in last year, we started to create a project called Main Street RM and Analytics. So while we might not have the exact data right now on those economic impacts, we are currently in the beta testing. We have BIAs across the province that are going to be putting their directory of businesses and property owners, because our BIAs in Ontario under the Municipal Act indicate that they are both our property owners and our businesses, unlike Alberta, where I believe it's still just the businesses. So we're trying, and that data will connect the two. It will make a connection between who the property owner is and who the business is, or the businesses are within that property. Not only that, it will allow OBIA to have proprietal, non-proprietal reporting that will be able to tell us how many vacancies we have on Main Street, how many employees we have. It won't go as deep as the sales data, but we will be able to use that, all of that data, to provide analytics to both economic development officers, but most important to the province, because it's time that Main Street is able to actually access the data that we can use to say, we do make a difference. We are where entrepreneurship starts, where innovation starts. You know, if somebody wants to start a business, they're going to start it on a Main Street first, because we're open and welcoming to that. So it's, you know, because we've been feeling that severe lack of dedicated data, OBIA decided we're going to do it ourselves. So with the help of the Ontario Ministry of Agriculture, Food and Rural Affairs, we are just beginning to unroll the CRM project that we are creating for BIA's use. But again, it will help OBIA to have that provincial reporting that will be so very, very important to it. So we're taking all of the work that we've been doing, the ROI project, Digital Main Streets project, and the information there, because Digital Main Street gives us data on where are technology trends going, where should the province be investing in the future for our small businesses. But I think the key piece that we all need to know is, we know that our BIEs create that sense of place by making that area more beautiful, by adding patios, by adding benches and banners, and creating that whole sense. But how do you turn that into economic data? How do you know that that's actually working? And the best way in many cases is back to that R&D. It's working, so other communities are copying it and ripping off and duplicating. That's just a kind of a beginning of where we're going right now, and I'd really be happy to report back to you on how our own project is going to help inform both economic development offices, our municipalities, our province, and even our federal government on the real and true state of Main Street.
No, and that's really interesting insight. And what I found very telling from your answer there is that in absence of data, you're going to create your own data program, because there's just so many different pressures to understand the impacts and influences on your main streets. And one of the other things as a takeaway is the biggest issue in transit right now, I hear this from every agency I work with, I see this myself, is social issues. And it's the same funding and social issues, and they're almost pretty much equal right now. So could be some interesting data opportunities there. I'm going to turn it over to Tom next for the next question. So there's been lots of discussion efforts placed on converting office spaces in our downtowns to really bring back residents, to bring back activities to our downtown cores, but also looking at how do you repurpose office space for retail uses, for recreational opportunities. How can data insights on economic activity help these efforts for these conversions?
Yeah, definitely a hot topic. And a city our size, over 1 million people, any comparable city likely has some office vacancy, especially a higher office vacancy as a result of return to work, either not going at the same speed or permanently shifting to remote work. So we're not unlike every other major municipality in North America, that there is opportunity there. The speed at which we've seen conversions hasn't been great thus far. I know our friends in Calgary have a bit of a stronger focus on the office conversions, and that there's been more activity there. From a data perspective, it's really, the private sector and private industry that's driving what decisions are made in terms of conversions. For us as a city, we are focused on increasing our residential population. Downtown Edmonton has just under 15,000 people in our core, which we saw a really sharp growth in the last decade. and we continue to see a positive trend in that direction, but we've definitely got opportunity to grow as we move towards a city of 2 million people, which is the center focus of our municipal development plan. And office conversions can do that. So whether or not it's from an office to retail or residential, that's really a private sector decision. We do have some grant programming that's helped incentivize construction. We granted close to $23 million in 2022 to support projects, and some of them included residential office conversions to residential. But the key piece really is the demand. So I caution that if we look at simply converting all of the office space, are we going to have in 5 years not enough office space and too much supply, either residential or commercial/retail? So it really is important to leverage, a forecasting lens when you talk about the data. But part of it is, how clear is your crystal ball? So I know one thing in Edmonton that we've seen in respect to office vacancy and just the potential for conversions, we've seen a lot of Class A buildings come on the market. So our ICE district, we've seen $4.5 billion in investment since 2005 in our downtown, and that's included a lot of high-end office space. So the older office space has become a bit more of a challenge. They've seen a growth in their vacancy. So I know that those building owners are exploring opportunities to convert them either into better office space themselves or into other uses. So I think it'll continue to be a focus, but from a data perspective, it's really about what's the demand going to be, and not today or tomorrow, really in that 5 to 10 year window. So it can be tricky, but it's definitely should be a data-driven decision.
Tom, thanks for that. And we look at forecasting data and transportation all the time, and the limitations of that sometimes as you look at your previous experience in the last 5, 10 years and the precedence of it, and how do you get some of those real-time economic data inputs on that would be, I think, probably quite helpful, which actually dovetails quite nicely with the next question. So I'm going to turn over to Sean. Canada has the fastest growing population in the G7. How can companies such as Moneris support municipalities? What data sources are currently available? How are you working with municipalities and leveraging your data into economic development type decision making? And also from the bigger centers to also our rural communities.
Right. Yeah. So, as a population grows, so does demand to build and even change existing infrastructure, whether it's that could be you talked about the LRT project on King Street, the dedicated streetcar lane. That was brought on by the growth of Liberty Village. Tens of thousands of human beings decided to move into one geographic area, and that created a business problem for the city of Toronto. And that business problem was, it's our responsibility to support the downtown with workers required to support the downtown economy. And it was that infrastructure change, or that idea of the infrastructure change with the dedicated streetcar line, that required study. So broadly speaking, I think that, when I think about how do municipalities, and any government organization, however big or small, how do they leverage our data? It's in relation to supporting a growing population. It's always around research and looking at all available data points. We are one data point. We are a very reliable data point because of our market share and our ability to look at all transaction types, credit or debit. That's a single data point. We always, whenever I talk with our clients or prospective clients, I always tell them, think about data holistically. We never recommend that you only use Moneris data, or you only use location data, or a single source of data is probably never a good idea, because there's almost an inherent bias there if you're looking at a single data source. So how do we support How do we support municipalities that are looking to study a growing population or infrastructure changes? We support them with the spending data to show them the economic impact of those decisions. And then those researchers look at that data and compare it to other data, data sources that they may have access to. That might be traffic data, like street lights. So if they're thinking about a new Costco moving into town, well, they could look at the traffic implications of that. They could also look at, okay, where do we feel that consumers are going to come from to shop at this Costco, and what else might they buy in our city or town or our suburb, whatever that is? What else might they buy when they're coming to shop at that Costco? And spending data can tell them that. So it's really as the population grows, infrastructure decisions need to be made, and those decisions need to be researched and validated. And that to me is where our Moneris data comes in.
I appreciate that. As a transportation planner, we do need to leverage several data sources, and streetlight definitely has been one of them. Moneris data was quite powerful. In the King Street example, you actually gave me a flashback to a meeting I went to years ago for King Street, where we presented to the board of the BIAs all together. And a lot of the board members were actually executives from the big banks downtown, and they were demanding action from us to help employees get to work. And it was quite interesting, our ability to then leverage the economic data and also transportation data and counts and a whole bunch of other data sources into really building a compelling case for change, which had not happened in many years. So
yeah, building the business case and also validating the outcome, right? And maybe that outcome is different than you thought it might be, in which case you can look at the data after, like at the end of the project, and decide, okay, what might, if the project worked as planned, great, but going forward, what do we need to tweak a little bit? It's that validation. So it's the research and then the validation at either end of the project.
Yeah, you're totally right. And there was definitely that on that project where there were tweaks made to different traffic rules and different ways that the street was used. And also when we go to councils, like we have to report back on the evaluation of our programs, and people take a very close eye to the data sets that you use on that. So, and I've seen that through my work on several different files across the country. I'm going to turn to Nelson for the next discussion question, but we do have time for audience Q&A. So I do ask that if you have a question for our panelists, please put in the chat, and we will try to answer as many of those as possible. So in the next couple of minutes, if you have a burning question, we'd love to talk about it with you. So please do put that in the chat, and we'll do that rather short order. So my next question is for Nelson. What types of data do you typically use to inform your policy recommendations? What limitations do you encounter? And what type of data does your stakeholders and council like to see, particularly in the rural context?
Yes, well, I got into the field of rural data kind of by request. I was doing more generic research and consulting on rural community development issues, and over again, rural staff, both municipal staff and NGO staff, were asking data-related questions, or asking me questions that they could have answered themselves if they had access to the data. And I see myself as kind of an unconsultant. If I'm successful, you'll need consultants less after I'm gone. So I try to build the capacity of rural staff and both municipal and NGO staff to make better use of available data. The things that came up most frequently were community leaders, when you ask them about the economic and demographic profile of their community, quite often the economic profile is 10 to 20 years out of date. That there's just been some really interesting changes in economies, both urban and rural, that your average person on the street hasn't kept up with. This is no criticism of rural people. If you look at the Ipsos polls, of what Canadians think about Canada compared to the 2021 census data, you'll see a lot of people really don't understand how they haven't kept up with changes that have happened. The other thing in demographic data, there aren't a lot of community leaders that have a good sense of the overall community and all of the demographic and social groups within the community. They tend to have a particular community of interest. So looking at data across the community can help bring people up to date on the economic, social, and environmental characteristics of the community. In the national project that I'm working on, and national standard for the assessment of rural community well-being, and that includes social, economic, and environmental well-being. That part of the impetus for that came out of recovery from disaster. So when a community is hit by a flood, a forest fire, a train wreck, or something like that, how do you assess that in a reliable, consistent way that the community has come back to a state of health and well-being? And there are 100 different approaches to that, and the national standard is trying to bring some consistency to that. So Rural Ontario Institute has taken on the task of doing a field test of key indicators from that national standard. And they're using a series of data dashboards. These are just under development now, so that's why I've been brought on as an advisor, and we're just starting to recruit a handful of field test sites to look at how the dashboard makes data from a variety of sources, largely from Statistics Canada, mostly from publicly available statistics, but some with custom data runs from Statistics Canada for this well-being project, which would be too complicated and expensive for each municipality to request on their own. But with an organization like Rural Ontario Institute, they can do one request for the whole province, and it makes it much simpler. In the field tests I've done so far, the data that's been most interesting has been the graphs of the demographic profile, and especially when you go from a graph of the provincial demographic profile, and you see kind of the wave of age groups, and then looking more at a regional demographic profile. So for example, by a county, by a census division, by a county, you see that profile, and then you look at the individual municipality, and you see in a lot of rural municipalities, the demographic profile is really skewed toward the older ages, and that explains some of the economic profile, some of the labor market issues, once you see the graphs of the demographic profile. The economic profiles that have caused a lot of interest is the graph of, there's data, but the graph has been particularly insightful, of 5 major industry sectors by municipality, and measured by number of people employed, and how that's changed over the last 10 years. And you can see very starkly the beginning of COVID and how that's changed the number of people employed, and how in a lot of small municipalities, the particular industry sectors that are in the top 5 are still in the top 5, but they're in a different order now. And there's been a real shift in number of employed, and as well as in job vacancies in certain industry sectors. And you're starting to see that some industry sectors are recovering much more quickly than others. So once you have that information, it starts to advise the municipalities, councils, the different trade groups. I have worked historically with small rural home builders associations, and how they are grappling with changing demand for types of housing, and grappling with labor market issues. And as you start to see the graphs of how the population is going, how the major industry sectors are going, you can make wiser decisions about how you're going to approach construction activity in a local area. The other thing that's on our wish list, and we haven't really got it working as well as we could, but it's a version of what Sean talked about in the geofence. In rural research, we call it the functional community, and it's the area the geographic area doesn't match a municipal boundary, but it's a geographic area that supports a certain function, like a hospital or a high school or a shopping center or a recreation center, and you have a functional community that supports that facility, but that functional community overlaps several municipal boundaries. And so we're looking at ways of making data available by functional communities so you can see what the catchment area is and see what the critical mass would be to have something that would benefit a group of communities. But you know, I'm working sometimes with really micro data, working with in particular one case that comes to mind, a very large geographic township that has 5,000 year-round residents and no village that has more than 1,000 residents. And downtown revitalization is get the general store open again. So we're looking at very small population groups, very isolated with very specific needs and total absence of public transit and need for local economic and social services that meet the needs of a very geographically dispersed population. So that the data that we're able to make user-friendly and readily available, and the accompanying graphs that make the data visual through the Rural Ontario Institute dashboard project is really helpful in some communities that are facing some pretty significant challenges. So anyway,
Thank you for that.
I could go on, but enough said.
No, that was quite helpful and thorough. There's a few points from there that I quite enjoyed. One is just the ability of capacity building, which is very challenging sometimes, regardless of the size of municipality, in terms of data insights and program development pieces. And the unconsultant, I feel like on that sometimes when you actually upskill or help upskill your clients and empower them to take on this work, and it kind of works you out of a job. And sometimes those are the funnest projects, oddly. There's a bunch of different sectors on this. Before I turn it over to the audience Q&A, we've been getting some great questions in the chat, and we'll start diving into those in just a moment. Is really the economic data is so important on a few things I've seen in my career. One is Nelson talked about this a little bit, was on disasters. There was recovery funds from when I worked the Calgary flood, and how do you dictate and allocate funds on certain programs? I had lots of meetings with the film industry when I worked at the city of Toronto in terms of you close down streets and for film productions, and you have to provide compensation for that from the businesses, and it's very relied on economic data and really how do you validate that from the business loss and continuity piece. COVID recovery funding was a huge one that our panelists have talked about today in terms of how you allocate those funds in different communities based on a formula and validation, and in transportation. So I think we've talked about that one a few times with infrastructure projects, and not just the King Streets of the world, but other projects we've probably seen, kind of more the larger scale ones that we're seeing in the build out of several Canadian cities. So I'm going to turn over to the audience Q&A here, and I'll start off with Brent's question. I quite like this question, curious about it a little bit myself too, is what types of funding resources are available to help municipality access and leverage data for both research and validation? Is it mostly project-based or broad-based ongoing funding? So is there any programs you're aware of, any sort of synergies you've seen with funding programs? Is there, or if you haven't seen that, is there something where you see the need for the development of those funding programs, or at a project or a program level? Okay.
I would definitely agree. Obviously, a lot of funding is challenging for municipalities because of the mush factor, of course. And there's a lot of grant funding that doesn't really focus directly on that sort of data. And most of it's project-based rather than ongoing. This is one of the challenges we came across with the return on investment. We got the project done, we created the indicators, but we couldn't get additional funding to actually take the indicators for a ride, which was, a really important aspect. You needed to be able to do that. And when we couldn't do it year after year, because, we're not-for-profit organizations, but our BIAs in Ontario are under the municipal, their local boards of council. So they also have limitations in grants that they're able to access. So you get a project done and then you can't actually ever move forward with it because it's just project-based funding. So I would agree, David, that we need to leverage, have more grant funding. Maybe it's more operational, that it becomes entrenched in our day-to-day world so that we can continue to provide the data that's imperative for all of us in order to keep our economies going. As I posted in there, our BIEs are main streets. Sorry, I always talk about BIEs because that's my world, but our main streets are places of human interactions. And we need to build that human interaction. And sometimes there's not data that really that can really acknowledge that aspect. And again, COVID really had us realizing how little human interaction we were able to get, and Zoom just didn't cut it. So, where once upon a time on a main street, a bank was our anchor, we're now finding it's our coffee shops. It's our places where we're bringing people together. But how can you really, how can you quantify and qualify human interactions?
Yeah, if I could jump in, the projects that I'm seeing are responding to the lack of funding for small and rural municipalities to support improved data access, data literacy, and that. So the Rural Ontario Institute project is a provincial project, but the Community Accounts project in Newfoundland and Labrador are also provincially funded, so that the data is being provided through large regional or provincial organizations that are able to access larger grants and provide data services to rural communities that wouldn't be able to access funding on their own. I've been around this business long enough that I remember times when there were more programs that individual municipalities could access for local capacity building. Most of those programs are gone now, and whether they're going to come back or what the political will is there, I don't know. But I think that I'm maybe speaking about something that's not my turn to speak about, but there's some interesting things happening with business data, with a collaboration of the Canadian Association of Chambers of Commerce and the Special Business Projects Unit at Statistics Canada. So I think it's through the collective voices that these data questions can be answered and access significant funding to do something on behalf of a larger group, where it is really tough for an individual BIA or an individual rural municipality to say, oh, we're going to go after a grant and we're going to do rural data all on our own. That's very tough. It's associations that will make it happen.
Hey, Sean, I wouldn't mind throwing this to you because I'm noticing a bit of a theme in the Q&A on not only just the funding piece. Like I'm quite curious, how are municipalities funding the work to actually harness this data and to really understand it? Like, it's one thing to actually find funding to utilize it, but how do you assess it and go through it? And then I think maybe the other piece of that question is there's a lot of dialogue in the chat, which is great, about smaller municipalities and smaller communities, and how you see funding is going to be an issue regardless of the size of the municipality, but maybe more acute with our smaller communities. So one, how have you seen these projects funded and who's funding them, even within these organizations? And then two, like how could this relationship and these fundings could be leveraged more on the smaller municipality side?
Right. So I have some visibility into how the clients are funding their projects, but not a lot, because that's the client, that's the client's business model. I can speak to a couple of projects. Some of it ends up, the money ends up coming downstream, from a provincial government, or I feel like we're talking about BIAs a lot on this call, and a lot of times it's funding that comes to the BIAs from a municipal entity. Like in Toronto, there's 80 BIAs. There's a BIA office. In Vancouver, there's 22 BIAs. There's folks there that look after the BIAs. I don't know for certain how that funding flows. Typically, in both private and public sector clients that we work with, it's a research budget. A lot of times, I shouldn't say a lot of times, I'm starting to see more of it. And I think this is a smart way to plan for a project, is to include a research and validation, assign a certain part of that budget for research and validation, to ensure you're making the best informed decision on the project, and also to validate and your decision at the end of it. And really what you're doing is you're taking, if it's a pedestrian, let's say you want to turn a downtown street or part of a main street into a pedestrian only corridor. There's a greater project budget for that, and to set aside 5 or 10%, whatever that number is, of that project to spend on data to support the project. I think that to me seems to be where the money would come directly, which is it comes from the budget that you're given, for the budget that you're working within. I saw a lot of provincial and federal support coming out of the pandemic, money being sent downstream. I know, we work with the Toronto Board of Trade, and they got a lot of funding directly from the federal government to report on the economic impact across, I think there were like 180 different geofences that we built for them within the city of Toronto to look at how to look at the consumer spending impact over the pandemic. So, typically that money is coming downstream, but more directly, it's really just a case of looking at the overall project budget and saying, I'm going to set aside 5 or 10% of this for validation, and planning, and dedicate that to data.
No, thank you for that. And on the transportation side, it's super valuable because we have to have defensible decisions. And a lot of it is when you're changing your communities, and you're changing communities, not only how people move, but also how they access your business is vitally important. And our councils will ask. They're going to ask a lot of questions. The VA will ask about this. Our VAs will ask about this. Our stakeholders will ask about this. The public will ask about this. So it's something that's definitely quite vital. We're on the top of the hour. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today. The webinar will be provided on the FCM Collective's website in the next couple of weeks, and you'll get an email link when it's available. But I appreciate the time from Nelson, Sean, Tom, and Kay, and everyone who joined us today to have this conversation about leveraging data and to support our main streets and downtown recovery. So thanks, everyone. Have a good rest of your day.